So good morning everybody, and thank you to Pepsi and to the RSA for hosting this important debate. I've been really looking forward to it, and it's enabled me to really sort of drill down and think through some of the bigger issues that we're facing. Also enabled me to read Tim's whole report, which is a luxury that I don't often get, so that's great news. So I'm going to basically talk from a perspective of Forum for the Future. We work directly with business on sustainable development, have been doing so for over 12 years now, and we work from a very positive, solutions-oriented context, and we're looking at finding ways forward that businesses can be more sustainable and more successful at the same time. So I'm going to be talking about what businesses are doing on decoupling and how they can operate within the current paradigm, but that also leads us on to think through, well, does that paradigm work in terms of the big challenges that we're facing? So I'm going to do a quick assessment of decoupling. I'm going to talk about some of the things that companies are doing around carbon reductions. I'm going to explore a little bit about how far an individual company can go towards radical decarbonisation, and then talk a little bit about sustainable consumption at the end. So decoupling, it's one of those words that we in the sustainable development movement bandy around. It's that pain-free way that we can get to a sustainable future without challenging the status quo too much. I sometimes use it at dinner parties if I want my guests to leave. But it's actually not something that is greatly used within the corporate parlance. I can't remember the last company who mentioned decoupling in a discussion that I was having. I bet PepsiCo, you have probably never had a discussion about decoupling. There are a few companies that talk about it. Alcoa, the aluminium company, IBM talks about it. The cement industry have recently started talking about it. And my question is that because it's too difficult, or is that because it actually isn't that useful in that context? And that does sort of lead me to sort of a number of challenges with it. So when corporates do talk about it, they generally are talking about relative decoupling. And so doing more with less, classic business case, being eco-efficient, so we can reduce our ecological intensity per unit of whatever unit they're using. And that leads us to some big challenges. So the cement industry last week, they have come together and they are now globally measuring their carbon emissions, and they said with great pride that the industry had decoupled its growth with its carbon emissions. So they have grown massively, 53% in the last year. Their carbon emissions have only grown by 35%. So they've decoupled. But that clearly isn't going to get us anywhere close to 80% by 2050. Probably on that stretch we will be increasing by 80%. Interestingly, Alcoa, the aluminium company, have decreased their emissions by 14% while growing by 20%. But so there are some positive stories around that. But that isn't where we need to be. And I have worked with the cement industry, and they are very sort of proud of their social contribution. They're also very proud of the fact that concrete is the second most used material after water. But they also contribute to 3% of emissions and are really sort of trying hard on this. But if that's the best they can get to when they are trying hard and looking at it, it presents a big challenge. So that whole relative decoupling is often described as carbon intensity, and that's a much more well-used corporate measure. So, and it's also gaining traction. The Carbon Disclosure Project measures carbon intensity. PepsiCo talks about carbon intensity. And in fact, you have decreased your carbon intensity in the UK by 5.9%, I believe, this year. But emissions have risen as part of that. So carbon intensity, important measure. It's important that we understand the intensity of our companies and the products relating to that, but it's not going to get us towards those absolute reductions that we need. So to get to absolute decoupling, we need absolute targets. And that then sort of throws decoupling into question again, because if you've got absolute targets, you don't really need to worry about decoupling at all. You just aim for your absolute targets. So the growth factor becomes sort of merely interesting as part of that. And absolute targets are growing. They're still not the norm, but we have a number of them emerging. Vodafone, 50% absolute reduction in carbon by 2020, and they're adding 10 million subscribers a month, so that's outside the context of growth. Sony Ericsson, 20% by 2015. Interface, classic example. Mission Zero, eliminate all negative impacts the interface has on the environment by 2020. I'm doing quite a lot of work with Interface, and they are quite nervous about the fact that 2020 used to be quite far away, and it is now that bit closer, but they're still drilling down and looking for the innovations they need to get to their mission. BT, UK climate impacts by 80% by 1997 levels by 2016, so big targets. And in the food and beverage sector, safe to say that those absolute targets are slightly fewer and far between, but Cadbury's has committed to 50% by 2020, and in the last year they decreased their absolute emissions by 3%, so on track. So absolute emissions are a must, and there's a move in that direction. Then there's the question of whether we're talking direct or indirect emissions. So the company boundary question is really important here, because clearly there's this whole risk of carbon leakage, in the same way that the UK talks about a 2% contribution to overall emissions. Calculations on the basis of the manufacturing of the goods that we consume suggest that it could be closer to 12%. So companies could be deferring their emissions down their supply chain. So it's important that companies recognise that as part of their commitments. So Sony Ericsson has its 20% reduction by 2012, but also talks about a 15% reduction on the full life cycle of its products. And that also starts to incorporate the whole innovation agenda and the opportunity that there is for products to help reduce others' carbon emissions. So we'll all be familiar with the fact that ICT has the potential to save about 7 to 8 gigatons of carbon in the next 10 years. So if it's applied. So clearly Sony Ericsson have focused on that opportunity. There are also a number of companies that are discussing that in more depth. So BASF, the chemicals company, talk through having a 3-to-1 carbon balance. So for every piece of CO2 that they emit, they save 3 times that through their products. Interesting dilemma in terms of the claims. I had a quite sort of ironic discussion with someone in the motor industry who was frustrated by the fact that the aluminium industry is aiming to be greenhouse gas neutral by 2030 on the basis of offsetting any emissions that it has through the gains in car efficiencies. So they're saying, well, any emissions that we have, we save through our products. But the guy in the motoring industry was saying, well, what about us? We want to claim those emissions. And then in the next breath said, and we also would like to claim the emissions of people who are driving more efficiently. And you're sort of like, well, you can't have it both ways, mate. But I'm going to leave that minefield to the carbon accountants, because I think it's the sort of thing that they will love. Anyway, so we need absolute targets, and we need to be incorporating the whole life cycle of a company. And then we also need to ask, how much is enough? So I think there's a real risk that decoupling becomes a smokescreen for the real challenge. So what we're talking about here is radical decarbonisation. And actually, the whole being more efficient, having absolute targets, if they're not the right absolute targets that reflect the global targets that we need to meet, our 80% by 2050 in the UK, then we're not going to get to where we need to. Now, this is quite difficult for companies to work out. So what is PepsiCo's contribution to that UK target, to global targets? And BT are exploring what that means. So BT are operating in the context of aggressive growth. So they want to grow into a global brand. And they have absolute targets for their UK business, but they have relative targets for their global business. And they have reconciled that by the fact that they want to have aggressive targets that they can't get out of, but they want them to be in the context of that sort of global challenge. So they've come up with what they're calling the Carbon Intensity Stabilization Index. Now, this is the sort of smart thinking that you get from BT. So they're still talking about relative targets, but what they've basically said is, if we need to get to a certain level, if we need to get to an 80% reduction by 2050, what is the contribution that what is the intensity that we need to get to? And they've calculated that in developed countries, that's about 9.6% intensity, so decrease in intensity year on year. So therefore, what does that mean for BT in terms of their absolute targets? Now, I suggest you go and have a look at how they explain that, because it needs graphs and things to really get into it. But essentially what they're saying is, for us to get the right absolute target, we have to understand what our contribution is. That links to our contribution to the global economy, but that means that we can get to the right sort of absolute targets. So that's where we are in terms of efficiency gains. I mean, what I've talked about is targets, and there is lots and lots of good examples of performance. Most of those targets have achieved where they need to get to, and they're doing that through carbon. They're doing that through efficiency. They're doing that through renewables. They're doing that through, some of them are doing that through things like green tariffs, which brings you back to the challenge of the macroeconomy. So if Cadbury's is achieving its 50% reduction partly by drawing on renewable resources, then whose reduction is that? And actually, do we need to be ploughing our energy much more into energy companies than into food and beverage? And so what is the level of shared responsibility that we're talking about here? It also doesn't get us to where we need to get to. And the next stage that the corporates we're working with are exploring is around the whole sustainable consumption agenda. So our default response to talking about growth in the corporate world is to talk about sustainable production and consumption. Most of the time we're talking about sustainable production. But there is a kind of growing steam around the whole idea of sustainable consumption and what that means. And we've been doing some work with Sainsbury's looking at, well, what would sustainable consumption mean for Sainsbury's? And we've put together an approach which essentially allows for evaluation of different business models according to a range of sustainability measures. So not just carbon. We're using the 5 capitals model to assess how much of a contribution a certain model makes, but also exploring how much it contributes to sustainable consumption. So asking questions about, if this business model goes to scale, will it actually contribute to giving people more sustainable choices? What sort of choice does it give? Is it just replacing incremental choice in one category, or is it offering a whole different kind of choice? And does it work on in a broader perspective? So this is work in progress. We're starting to assess various different models for sustainable consumption, and we have a database of things that are assessed against that. So from the streetcar model to M-Pesa, Vodafone's eco-consumer, right through to the Grameen Bank, all of these models that are out there being tested, looking at consuming differently, what do they mean and what would they mean if they went to scale? And for somebody like Sainsbury's or indeed PepsiCo, that's about sort of looking at those models, exploring them, and working on a kind of buy, borrow, partner approach. So if you can look at acquiring more sustainable businesses as part of your acquisition strategy, this is a way of assessing that. And indeed, that's one of the things that BT have committed to in their global expansion is acquiring businesses that align to their principles and their strongly held objectives around corporate responsibility. Then there's the borrow. Some call it copy, but I'm being more generous natured than that. And then there's obviously the partnerships with social entrepreneurs with different kind of growth models. So where does that leave us? There's a lot of things that are happening out there. We've got absolute targets. We've got strategies for decarbonisation, not radical decarbonisation in the main, I'm afraid. We've got low carbon product development. We've got the opportunity to explore new business models. And also we have the whole sort of raft of technology, which I haven't, and I'm not going to explore in depth today. So there's lots that we can do within that current paradigm, but the starkness of the challenge that we need to achieve, a 21 times efficiency gain is what's needed in order to get us to the sort of emissions that will keep us below dangerous climate change. And that's factoring in increased population, increased affluence. That isn't going to be achieved by all of that alone. So the last piece in the corporate toolbox is to actually start exploring the context within which we're in and understanding the growth dilemma, understanding what sorts of things can be done within that context, but also seeking to challenge the wider context. And I think that to get to whatever growth we need, and I've got to admit, at Forum we haven't got the answer to the growth question. It's quite difficult to discuss challenging growth within the boardroom. And in terms of absolute targets, I'm yet to have a discussion of a company who says, well, we're not going to meet our absolute carbon targets unless we shut down that production line. So there's a big challenge there. But understanding that context and challenging it and pushing the agenda is the way forward for companies like PepsiCo.